Okay, Jordan. So we've got it recording, and
Oh,
hopefully you can hear me just fine. I'm going to turn you up just a little so that I can hear you better.
okie dokie.
Okay, so you're the only one in here, but at least you're in here. So woohoo! We
Woohoo!
can still go. And naturally, of course, I'm going to mark down that you were here both times today. So
Woohoo!
yay, you're holding up the fort for the rest of them. So hopefully I'll be able to get these recordings up tomorrow. It just takes time to load them onto YouTube, and then I'll place links in and everything. But I'll probably create a folder for these recordings so that the links can be viewed inside the fiction folder. But
Awesome.
I'll figure all that tomorrow and tell people exactly where it is once it's been uploaded. I'm still in the process of grading stuff. I'm way behind because I didn't have access to internet, so we're just going to get through all of it. But hopefully tonight we can talk a little bit about another story this week. And it's not exactly connected to what we talked about with Desiree's baby, and yet there are certainly elements of it that have similarities. And that's one reason I put them in the same uh, week. One is that obviously it's about people who are less than stellar and who are definitely expressing quite a large level. Oh, Brooke's in here too. Yay. And Samaya's in here. Woo. If I'm talking and I don't notice that you're here or something, just let me know. But I'm going to write you guys down too. Brooke. Okay, so this one, what if you don't know, and I don't, do you guys recognize the name of the author at all?
I do.
You do, and what do you know what he wrote?
Oh, was he the one that wrote The Time Machine?
Yes, he
Oh, thank goodness, I remember
is.
the right one.
Yes, he was one of a couple of different science fiction writers very early. I mean, we're talking turn of the century early. So this was long before, of course, we ever had space exploration. He and Jules Verne were really the two biggies in science fiction. Although a lot of people say that the very first science fiction novel was probably Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. But
Yeah.
H.G. Wells' Time Machine is actually a really fascinating book. And he wrote other books as well. And then Jules Verne stuff. I mean, what, 40,000 Leagues Under the Sea? That's a very good book. He also wrote Journey to the Center of the Earth, which of course now we know is like super dense and we, die from the gravity pull. But anyway, there are things, of course, we didn't. And he also, Jules Verne also wrote about going to the moon, and they just kind of made a ship, and there was no idea of what space was or what the moon was made of or anything like that. So, but this is in some ways, H.G. Wells, most of these people who are writing wrote novels as well as short stories, but I'm not making you read all the novels, just the short stories. So um and I guess you don't have to read any of them. You're just not going to do really good on the test, I guess. But in this case, though, what we're dealing with is something that has long fascinated people, this idea of, people leaving treasure somewhere. I think about Treasure Island and all these other, novels that are kind of, well, and even what do we have today? The um, Pirates of the Caribbean. We had a Disney ride, which is still fun to ride, but then we have all this whole series of movies, all of them, surrounded about the idea of pirates and seeking treasure, and where was treasure buried and all this kind of stuff. And so in this case, though, it's I don't know if it feels this way to you because it's in such a foreign place, and because of course they were led there by the details of someone who was not. I mean, these are Englishmen, and yet they were led there or essentially given the clues to get there by someone who was not English. And they make a point to point out how much he's not one of them. And yet it's in such an exotic place that readers can almost not be surprised by the things that are there. And the truth is other places, especially places that we're not used to, Africa, Australia, they may have creatures. I don't know if you've ever seen online when somebody says, look what I found in my backyard. And of course they live in Australia, and the spider is like a foot long from its feet to tips of one side of its feet to the other side. And you're just like, no, I'm not moving to Australia ever because of that. We're just not used to it. And yet there are things that grow here or live here that other people aren't used to, and it's not just insects and creatures, it's plants. There are some plants. I still remember watching, and I don't know if you guys have ever seen the movie, what is it called? The Gods Must Be Crazy. Do you remember ever seeing a movie? It's old. I mean, it's not black and white old, but it's meant to look like one of those old kind of travel logs where, like National Geographic or something like that, where it's a nature show. But it's about the Bushmen in Africa, and essentially this Bushman, it's kind of what happens when a very primitive group encounters modern society, and what do they do? How do they interact? And yet in that movie, there are times when he'll say, well, don't stand next to that tree. And she'll say, why? And the tree starts like weeping sap on her, and it's itchy. And there are all these rules because they have different, I mean, we don't have, for instance, native lions, native tigers, rhinoceros, hippos. We see them in the zoo, but we don't have to live with them. And so there are a lot of things we don't understand about how those animals work. And so just that exotic climb is something that that's appealing for a lot of people. So H.G. Wells didn't just write about futuristic sort of stuff, although his science fiction was really very much, it's probably one of the earliest dystopian novels, because he's talking about the world in the future and what happens. And there's actually a really good version of the Time Machine that was made probably 1980, around 78, 79, 80, because I was a kid when I watched it. And it essentially said, that it took H.G. Wells's story and it put it after World War III. So essentially we'd had the nuclear holocaust. And then this is what the world looked like after that happened. How did the world survive? How did humans survive? And so it kind of melded the book with real science, because of course, when H.G. Wells wrote this, there was no nuclear anything. There were no atom bombs. There was none of that. So, because it was written so much earlier. So there's still timeliness to it. And, we have a lot of dystopian books today, especially in young adult literature. But the truth is there is a lot of fear. What is the future going to be? And there have been a lot of books written about, well, what happens if, there's a nuclear holocaust? Or, I think about there's YA books like Z for Zachariah, and yet there are On the Beach by Neville Shute was written, I think, in 1955. And it's a very stark look at what happens in a nuclear holocaust. And the stark look says, we'll all die. And it's a really depressing book, but it's really well written too. And it's poignant, it's sad. And yet it also is trying to, get people to think before they, rush to nuclear capability and try to use it against each other. So the truth is a lot of this kind of stuff is already happening. In this case, though, this is just a short story. It's a very finite event, but it still has the exotic elements that are going on. It's a very unknown place, and the mystery of the place is half the interest. But it also comes with moral elements as well. So people who come in with bad intentions and who do bad things to other people may find karma comes back and gets them. And that's kind of the point of this. Just like with Desiree's baby, here's Armand judges his wife and essentially contributes to the end of her and her baby and his baby because he judges her for her race. Well, at the same time, these people felt superior, felt like they could certainly trick, gain from the ignorance of somebody else or the inferiorness of somebody else, and yet their own selfish desires are what lead them to their own problem. I see. I have not. I'm going to write that down because I love cool new books. I especially like. I'm not like. I don't have to read dystopian books, but I find books that kind of mix science with the future really interesting. I know there's another one that deals with genetic therapy. What's it called? Brave New World. And that's actually, it's not a depressing book, but it is fascinating. And it deals with essentially if we were cloned. Alas, Babylon. I'll have to remember that. If nothing else, I hope this class really encourages you guys to go find stuff you like and encourages you to go, even go back to things that you'd heard of but you've never read, because some of these can be really fruitful reads when you have time, but and a lot, you can buy cheap copies of a lot of these books too. You can, I mean, some you can probably buy paperback versions for $1 or $2. They're that inexpensive, or get them on, a lot of them are open source. They're in the public domain, so you can get them for free if you read them on a Kindle or something like that, or on, you can get I have a Kindle app on my phone, so I don't have to read on a Kindle. And so you can read them on your phone for free. And that's the case for a lot of these writers. So I think it's 70 years after their death or something, they the thing opens up and they become free. So I'm all about free books. I mean, obviously they're not going to benefit from it anymore because they're long dead. But if you can find them, and I mean, they're fun to try. And honestly, there's a lot of rewarding literature out there. So okay, so let's talk about this one though. So where are they? And we get the place first, the setting, and we get the characters in the setting, but then we kind of get backstory after they start the story. So it kind of starts in the middle, and which is a lot of short stories. They start kind of in the middle of the action and then they go backwards, and then we find out how the guys got here. So first of all, where are they?
The jungle?
Yes, so they're in, and we don't know, do we know exactly where they are?
I didn't notice it where it said.
No, it's more of a, well, we got, it says, they keep it very vague. So, the sea, so they're in, they're coming in, and there's a little river, so where the delta of the river is, and there's a white surf of reef, and he's looking at a piece of paper. The paper had the appearance of a rough map, and then it said, you can dimly make out in almost obliterated pencil the outline of the bay. And then Evans says, here's the reef and here's the gap. But we don't have an actual, like, it doesn't say this is in, this country in this continent, or we know it's far from England. That's all I mean, we know that they were in a very, distant place when they found out about what's going on. And then they, you know, got the map. And then they even say, so they're looking at this map. It says what these little marks down here are for. And he says, it looks like the plan of a house or something, but he doesn't know what the dashes are. I can't get a notion. And he says, and what's the writing? Well, the writing's in Chinese. Why? Who did they get this
Because
map from?
the Chinese man
Right. And what did they do with this man?
killed him.
Yeah. Now, why did they feel that they could do that?
They viewed him as less than.
Right. Oh, well, we're going to sneak on this, not quite human person. And the truth is this is, I mean, we know, I didn't mention it specifically last time when we were talking about slavery, but for a long time, slaves were considered to be 3/5 of a person.
Yeah.
And it's horrible to think about now, and yet it's a quantifying measure that really does illustrate how much people saw other genetic factors or other races or even other regions of the world as inferior. And they make fun of, oh, of course, and they talk about the fact that he was Chinese, but they can't read it. And so it's not like they know his language and their own. They don't know his language at all. And so they got an advantage over him, probably because it was more like it was 2 to 1, you know. So they took the map after killing him, but they see themselves as, wow, we won one, you know, we got one over on him. But they don't consider the murder of him as equal to the murder of each other or something, because they see themselves as equals to each other, but he's inferior. And this is not uncommon at all. So it's just kind of, but that doesn't make us, and it shouldn't make people even reading at the time. It's not like they look at that and go, oh, well, that makes sense. No, they're like, ew, these people are awful. And more it feels like that, especially because we don't get right away that they killed him. And then it even says, you know, oh yeah, he was Chinese. And then the guy says, well, they all were. And so as they're paddling in, as they're going up, they are kind of expressing what they did. They're kind of, through their dialogue exchange, we get little snippets that reveal slowly what they did to get to where they are now. So they think, according to the map, that, you know, this is early on in the story. They think, oh well, we're really close to the treasure, and yet it says plainly they're going up, and it says, though they were so near the treasure, he did not feel the exaltation he had anticipated. And so part of it is that it was really hard to get there. So they struggled just to get where they are. The long night voyage, you know, an unprovisioned canoe, so they're hungry, and he's really tired. He tried to arouse himself by directing his mind to the ingots of the Chinaman that the Chinaman had spoken of. So he's like, but that gold, you know, they're gold ingots. He talked about the gold ingots. And so he's trying to, you know, get excited about it, even though he's exhausted. But he's hungry and thirsty. Probably the salt water didn't help, you know, but they're going up, and so he's doing all the paddling. Presently he began to doze, and so he's exhausted. He really is. But then, and this is when, so, you know, part of it is, you know, part of the appeal of this story is that it's so exotic. You know, we're in a place we've never been before, and that will be necessary given what happens, because things happen there that would not normally happen, if that makes sense. They wouldn't happen if you were just, I mean, what would we face if we were out in the bogs in Georgia, in southern Georgia? What would happen to us? I know what would happen to me is, first of all, I would be eaten alive by mosquitoes, because I get eaten by mosquitoes just walking to my mailbox to pick up the mail. But if I were out in like Okefenokee Swamp or something, I would face the mosquitoes. I would face alligators, because there are alligators everywhere in there. I would face a lot of different bugs, other creatures. The alligators would be the scariest thing for me, but the truth is a lot of what we would deal with, we already know, like, because we're more used to it out here. They are actually just like us. They're encountering a world, and we're getting to watch them encounter it, that we've never seen a world like this before. We've never, this is all new. And of course now it's nighttime, but he says, okay, once again, he goes back to, in his memory, and this is where we get kind of what happened. Okay. When he and Hooker had hit upon the Chinaman's secret, and he saw the three men, silvered on one side by moonlight, on the other glowing from the firelight, and heard them talking together in pidgin English, for they came from different provinces. So because they speak different forms of, because China actually doesn't have one unified language, it actually has dozens of languages, kind of like Africa has dozens of languages, you know. And so they, to communicate with each other, these people who were all descendants from China spoke pidgin English to each other. And Hooker heard what they were talking about. They talked about a Spanish galleon from the Philippines that ran aground. So, a ship ran aground, and its treasure was buried essentially so that one day they could go back and get it. And it lay in the background of a story. So they were talking about this treasure as they were telling another story. And so they finally, they left it, left the treasure behind. Then Shanghai, only a year since, wandering ashore, had happened upon the ingots hidden for 200 years, had deserted his junk and reburied them with infinite toil, single-handed but very safe. He'd laid great stress on the safety. It was a secret of his. In other words, he'd made it so that no one could get to it, or it would be very hard to get. Now he wanted to help to return and exhume them. Well, wanted help. So he was talking to the other men like, let's go and get this treasure. And he even pulls out the map. So the two British men were listening, and they're like, ooh, their curiosity is piqued. Of course, their greed comes into play. And then Evan's dream shifted to the moment when he had Shanghai's pigtail in his hand. The life of a Chinaman is scarcely sacred to a European's. And this kind of goes along with, what we know in history, with the way that Europeans, when they kind of went, explored around the world, often they treated the peoples they founded like that those weren't real people. They were no more than animals. And so in this case too, he remembers killing Shanghai. In the end, but it even says, and this is a hint to what's going to happen, of course, in the end, Shanghai had grinned a most incomprehensible and startling grin. And essentially, he took Shanghai by the pigtail, how big the yellow, and of course, he uses the word yellow. It's funny because in the other story earlier, the one, Desiree's baby, they used the term yellow, but it meant someone who was mixed slave and white. In this case, though, and this is unfortunately the way that they've been termed for a long time, many people of Asian descent are termed to be yellow. And so it's just like, when you call Black people Black, they're actually not. They're really brown. Very few of them even have dark enough skin that would ever come close to that. And even white people aren't really white. I'm the pinkest person I think I've ever met in my entire life. So we have all these, and yellow is just another one of those derivative. It's just not. It's not. And he even called. It's funny too because he's so snotty about it. How big the yellow brute was. Calls him a brute, and yet he's killing him. And so it's just then the bright, and it's funny because he's kind of like dreaming about all of it, and he even it comes out, of course, that he's got him by the but we don't get all the images exactly because he's just kind of he's fallen asleep at the boat, and he's just kind of dreaming about it. And so Evans and Hooker essentially, one of them wakes the other one up, and they're at the mouth of the lagoon. So he kind of like drifts through. They're both really tired, which is not the best time to go and explore anything anyway. But they say, okay, I think we're in the right place. There are the 3 palm trees. If we go to those bushes and then strike into the bush in a straight line from here, we'll come to it when we get to the stream. And so they're it's that kind of adventure. And even if we don't like people, I don't know if you've ever watched a movie where, for instance, people are planning a huge heist, like they're going to rob this Swiss bank or something, and they're going to get through all of these different things to get the money. And it's an adventure, and yet when you think about it, they're not supposed to be robbing banks, so there's a questionable morality anyway. In this case, though, we know that they killed the guy, and so there's definitely questionable morality. So we're on the adventure with them, and everything's kind of from their point of view. and yet they're not the greatest, nicest people either. Um, so, we understand they're like the guy being thirsty. But we understand, the struggle, and we definitely might sympathize with that, and at the same time we're very well aware, and the author constantly reminds us of who these people are and what they've done to get here. They stole a map after killing a person, and it was the person who had supposedly set the whole thing up and made it hard to get to the treasure. So they finally they keep on so we should be uncomfortable, I guess is what I'm saying. And they actually find fresh water finally, so they're not, they're not, I guess, parched as they might be. They were about to land among the thick growth that overhung the water. It says we'll have to scramble through this to the beach to find our bushes and get to the line, get the line to the place. And so they decide they're going to paddle around to the other edge so that it's easier to get to where they need to be. And I mean, it's pretty realistic in how we're doing. I don't know if you guys had trouble visualizing that. I didn't. And they go into the forest. Once they go into the forest, then they're kind of in the shade. So it's a definite dense forest. So I think the details for me really help me imagine what's going on. And especially as the shadows get deeper and deeper and deeper as they go further into the area. And so it even says the shadow deepened. And then Evan shivered. It seems almost cold here after the blaze outside. And then Hooker says, I hope we're keeping to the straight. Now it's hard in a woods, in a jungle. It's hard to know if you're going in the right direction at all. Although it seems by the end of the story, I think they probably were. And that's the problem. And so then they find the river. And they kind of describe many flowers and a creeper with shiny foliage. But a lot of this, they don't name, he doesn't name the plants. Why? Because they've never seen any plants like these before. So it even says on the water, there floated big oval leaves and a waxen pinkish flower, not unlike a water lily, but it's not a water lily. So it's giving us some, something to imagine, and yet making it clear that it's different, that this is still an other kind of place. Okay, so it says we have swerved a little from the straight, said Hooker. That was to be expected. If we beat a little way up and down the stream, we should come to something. And then Evans is already starting to argue. And he says, you said, and then he said there was a heap of stones. And so they're trying to find that. So they advanced slowly, looking curiously about them. And Evans stopped and said, what the devil is that? What is it? He says something blue, and there's a gentle swell of the ground. And what is it that he found?
It's a dead body.
Yeah, a dead person. The thing was the figure of a Chinaman lying on his face. And yet he's just stopped. And the men are kind of looking at it going, okay, well, it's a dead body. And it says nearby was a spade. And further off lay a scattered heap of stones, close to a freshly dug hole. And then Hooker says somebody's been here before. Well, obviously there's a dead body sitting right there. And then Evans gets mad. He starts to swear and rave and stamp on the ground. Hooker turned white but said nothing. He advanced towards the prostrate. And it's kind of funny. This when I was reading this scene again for today, it reminded me of at Mount Everest, because I'm not ever going to go, because 10% of the people who go die, who attempt to go up the mountain die, and I'm not willing to be that 10%. But to climb up to Mount Everest today, you have to walk past what they call Rainbow Row. You have to walk past a whole row of dead bodies. So all the people who didn't make it, who died up there, are still there, frozen solid, lying on the path to go up to the top of Mount Everest. And so you have constant reminders of all the dead people because of all the colors they wore. So it's all different. They're all wearing bright reds and yellows and greens and all sorts of colors, with the ski outfits and the big coats. And those coats take years to disintegrate. And even once they do, the bodies are so solid. There's actually an encyclopedia, well, no, what was it? National Geographic did a special. They found some of the original explorers' bodies. They actually identified them from their clothing, but the bodies are still intact. They're still they're just frozen solid and embedded in the ice and snow up there. It's horrible. I just imagining that makes me go, nope, I'm just going to turn right around and go back home because I don't want to die. But here they already have, that's going to add a shade of peril. These people are going to go, okay, this guy is dead. So, but Hooker goes over, he advances to the prostrate body, saw the neck was puffed and purple and the hands and ankles swollen. And so he's just kind of disgusted by the whole thing. And then he gave a cry of surprise. He shouted to Evans, who was following him slowly. And then he says, "You fool, it's all right. It's here still." So in other words, there's the Chinaman who's dead, but he didn't get the treasure, essentially is what he's saying. And so Evans hurried to the hole. Already half exposed by the ill-fated wretch beside them lay a number of dull yellow bars. He bent down in the hole and, clearing off the soil with his bare hands, hastily pulled one of the heavy masses out. As he did so, a little thorn pricked his hand. And this is where this is that right there, that step. Had they turned around, they might have survived. But they rushed to the hole. And just as he's, clearing soil away with his bare hands, he feels a thorn prick his hand. He pulled the delicate spike out with his fingers and lifted the ingot. Only gold or lead could weigh like this, he said exultantly. Hooker was still looking at the dead Chinaman. He was puzzled. And so he goes, okay, so he stole a march on his friends, which means he hurried ahead of them. He came here alone, and some poisonous snake has killed him. I wonder how he found the place. And Evans just doesn't care. He's holding the gold, and he's like, "Who cares? Who cares if someone from China died? Asian, it doesn't matter. We shall have to take this stuff to the mainland piecemeal and bury it there for a while. How are we going to get it to the canoe?" He took his jacket off and spread it on the ground and flung 2 or 3 ingots into it. Presently, he found another little thorn had punctured his skin. "This is as much as we can carry." And then suddenly, with a queer rush of irritation, "What are you staring at?" And Hooker says, "I can't stand him. It's so like," and Evans just dismisses him, again, racial epithets. And Hooker looks into his face. He goes, "I'm going to bury that anyhow before I lend a hand with this stuff." So he's going to bury the person. He says, "Don't be a fool, Hooker." And he's looking at the brown soil and he says, "It scares me somehow." And Evans, of course, already has ingots in his jacket. And so Hooker's, though, he hasn't moved. He shivered again as his eye rested upon the blue figure of the man. So remember that body's still there. He stared searchingly among the gray depths between the trees. "What's come to you, Hooker?" says Evans. "Have you lost your wits?" And Hooker says, "Well, let's get the gold out." He took the ends of the collar of the coat in his hands, and Evans took the opposite corners, and they lifted the mass. "Which way? To the canoe?" And then Evans says, "My arms ache still with that paddling." And he says, "Curse it, but they ache. I have to rest." Evan's face is now white, and little drops of sweat stood out on his forehead. It's stuffy somehow in the forest, so he's getting hot. And so he's kind of getting a little irrational. And then Hooker is looking in his face. Evans starts to breathe heavily. He says, "Can't you speak?" And Hooker says, "What's the matter with you?" And then Evans clutches his own throat. What happened exactly? As Hooker handled the ingots, he felt a little prick on the ball of his thumb. Of course, probably by this time, you guys figured out already that the little pricks of the thorns that Evans endured on his hands, that those are affecting him now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So at this point though, remember Hooker, he's fine, right? He hasn't been pricked by anything. But then he says, he says, "Can I do it? Can't I do anything for you?" And he says, "Put the gold back on the coat." As Hooker handled the ingots, he felt a little prick on the ball of his thumb. He looked at his hand and saw a slender thorn, perhaps 2 inches in length. Evans gave an inarticulate cry and rolled over. So it's like Hooker, first he gets that dead body, the man in blue, but then he watches essentially as Evans slowly succumbs to the poison that's in those thorns. And he thought of the little dashes in the corner of the plan, and in a moment he understood. He goes, "God help me," for the thorns were similar to those the Dyax poison and use in their blowing tubes. So in other words, he recognized finally what they probably were. And he calls for Evans, but Evans is already, he's like twitching his last twitches, and he's almost dead. Then Hooker began to suck furiously at the little pink spot on the ball of his thumb. Presently, he felt a strange aching pain in his arms and shoulders, and his fingers seemed difficult to bend. And then he knew that sucking was no good. So it's an extremely potent poison. And abruptly he stopped, and sitting down by the pile of ingots and resting his chin upon his hands and his elbows upon his knees, stared at the distorted but still quivering body of his companion. And essentially he dies. So not, first they come upon one body, and now if anybody ever does finally get to this place, they're going to come upon 3 bodies. And in some ways, you could certainly say, well, they got what they deserved. The fact that they killed the person with the map is definitely against them morally. So, but at the same time, what is it just don't kill people and take their maps, or is there something more to this?
I feel like there's more.
Okay, so what else could this author be kind of illustrating for us?
Well, when I wrote my journal on this, I said that I feel like it's the author is trying to tell us to be more cautious and to be less greedy
Mm-hmm.
and maybe to pay more attention to things.
Well, and had Hooker, because the 2 men did things differently. Obviously, Evans was the one who was in a hurry. Evans was the one who was rushing into everything. Evans went straight to the rocks, the pile of rocks, and looked at the hole and then started pulling the ingots out. Had Hooker stayed back and stayed with the other body, had he kept not moving, Evans even said, "Aren't you going to say something?" Had Hooker stayed where he was, he might have survived. He might have, I mean, because it's not like 45 minutes went by. This is a quick thing. And he was much more reluctant, much less likely to step forward and rush, in his way, but he was trying to help Evans. But had he waited even 2 minutes to do that and kind of watched, he was already wary. So the truth is, yeah, I mean, we may not like people, but yeah, and definitely the attitudes they had towards this man that they killed, they certainly felt like they were superior. And it could be intellectually or even craftily, well, I'm smarter than you because I outwitted you. And yet in a way, part of the disturbing image of them killing him is that he was grinning at them. Why was he grinning? Well, we know now it's because he knew if they took the map and went, they'd probably die. So he knew what the future was. It's funny because it's a little bit like there's actually this really is kind of a parable. It's a fable, because it's kind of like it's an old story that comes from Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, but there are other versions in other countries as well. But it's called The Three Men in Death. It's actually what they based the Deathly Hallows on in Harry
Oh,
Potter. But the story about the three men in death, it's also called the Pardoner's Tale, and I'll type that into the message. But it's three men are upset because people are dying of the plague, and so they get drunk, and then they boast that they're going to go and find Death and kill him, so he can't kill anybody else. And so they ask this old man, they're wandering around the town, and they ask him, oh man, well, where can we find Death? And he says, oh, well, Death is under that tree over there. And they go, great, we're going to go find Death. And they go to the tree. Inside the tree is they find a buried treasure underneath right by the roots. And they're so excited. Wow, we didn't find Death, but at least we got this treasure. So they send one of the three men back to town, and he's supposed to go get wine and food so they can celebrate. Well, he goes to town and he's thinking, well, why should I share? Why do I have to go to town and get the food? Why, they always make me do all the work. I know what I'll do is I'll poison the wine, so when I come back, they'll drink it and they'll die. And then I'll get the gold all to myself. Well, the two men, while he's gone to town, the two men sit under the tree and they go, well, why should we split this among three people? How about when he comes back, we're going to kill him and then we can just split it in half. And the two guys are like, yeah, that's a great idea. And so when the man comes back with the poisoned wine, the two men kill him. So there's one guy dead. And then the other two men drink, yay, we get to, we don't have to share as much. And they drink the wine and they die of the poison. And so Death meets all three of them under the tree. So that's where Death could be found. But it's that moral that, you think you're going in a certain way, but it's your actions that actually lead to your downfall. And it's your selfishness and it's your greed and things like that. So this is very much that same thing. You think, oh, this is an adventure and I'm superior and I'm going to outwit the man who buried this stuff, but you're wrong. And I don't know if you've ever read the story. A lot of it's often taught in it. I don't know if you would have read it in high school, but it's called To Build a Fire. And it's actually the same type of, don't think you can outwit nature. Don't think that you're smarter than you are. And it's not so much about greed, it's about being essentially thinking that you're unstoppable, that you can't die. But in this case though, it's absolutely about greed. These men were willing to kill someone for something, and that gold became such a draw that they ran in where they rushed in. Fools rush in, and that's what they did. They rushed in too fast before they figured out what was really the danger. They didn't understand the marks on the map, and so they ignored them, and it got them. So I don't know that any of us truly felt horribly bad for these two people, especially because neither one of them had a tremendous amount of, great character. But we certainly can take, not rushing after. I mean, it even affects, as a parable, it even affects our greed in other ways. You can take things from someone, but it can come back and get you in the end. Your actions will have consequences. And theirs certainly did, although in a very, unique and exotic sort of way. Certainly, I'm really glad that I don't live near plants that have these little poisonous thorns that kill people. That's not ever where I want to be living. So hopefully, it makes me less adventurous, these kinds of things. But at the same time, most of us, I think, wouldn't take the risks that these two men did, going off into a place we'd never been before to explore just for something like this. Now, people do. They take these kinds of risks all the time. But it certainly is much more of a warning sort of story than otherwise. You guys have any other comments? Anything you know that you observed or that you want to make sure we cover? Any questions? It absolutely is, you know, even though it's less direct than the Desiree's Baby, it absolutely is speaking against that racism, that cultural prejudice. Absolutely. So I think you're absolutely right, Jordan. Any other questions? I want to make sure everything's cool. Okay, the marks on the map, like the plan of a house. I'm not sure. The plan of the house might actually be more like the mound of rocks, but honestly, we don't know. Much of, you know, the only reason we even know that the little marks on the map are the little tiny marks are the thorns is because that's what Hooker decides at the end. At the very, very end, it says that. Yeah, the grin occurs to him, and then he even says, where is that? He looked through the, where is it? He thought of the little dashes in the corner of the plan, and in a moment he understood. And so he realizes what those are. But that's the only reason we know that we have that exactly aligned. The truth is, though, remember them. It's not just because they couldn't speak Chinese or read Chinese or anything, because remember, there's already a dead body there too. And so it may be one of those things where I guess it's like, you know, if there were a treasure inside the pyramids, you know, no one's made it out alive to prove it. It's that kind of a thing, you know, like everyone is taking a chance going, you know, using this map. Now, even if what if somebody were just to happen upon this place and they see the map? Because you remember, these two guys are dead now. So they see the map and they're like, well, what is this? If they rush in, especially if they see all the gold ingots, then they'll die too. And so it's, who knows how many dead bodies are going to eventually, you know, be left there. But it always makes me think, it's disturbing in that it makes me think of Mount Everest and all the bodies just kind of left behind. Any other questions? Any other comments? If not, we're done. And I will see you guys next week live. So I'll try to have all of the live things linked inside the lessons so that you can just click on each one of those links really easily. And that's what I'll do from here on out. So, but I appreciate you guys coming. I've marked you definitely down. I think we lost Samaya at some point, but if you do end up with questions, remember, you can always put questions in journals as well. So there's nothing that says you have to have all the answers when you write your journal. I'd really rather that you say, you know, I just don't know. This says this and that says that. So what's the truth? It's okay to say, I don't know. I just want the journals to be honest. So, and that way too, I can know what I need to cover here. So I will see you guys. Have a good evening. I will see you next week. Have fun reading. Remember, the due dates are all kind of put off for a bit. Just try to catch up. And I'm glad, I think everybody has power back for the most part. So, but hopefully people will contact me if they don't. So take care. I'll see you guys next week. Bye.
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 Take care.